Hello. Today I wanted to talk a little bit more about AI data and process because I keep bringing it up as being something really important for your solutions, your AI automations, your AI agents, whatever they might be. So I want to just go a little bit deeper into that today. We'll see how long it goes and where we end up going with the conversation. So here I have like a little pyramid, and I think I mentioned the last time I was still debating whether data or process is at the bottom, but thinking about it more since the last videos, process definitely should be at the bottom because the process is really kind of tied to your goal, right? What is it you're trying to achieve with this AI system, this AI agent or automation, whatever it might be? And if you have a goal, you're going to have some way to reach this goal, right? As you go through your little labyrinth, and that is essentially translating into the process that you need to achieve. And then in order to make that goal happen, your AI has to be making the correct decisions at the points it's making choices. And the only way it's going to be making good decisions is if it has good data, good understanding of you, your business, or what it's trying to do. And that's relating here to this data process here in the middle layer. And then once you have those two things, you achieve like the pinnacle of that AI execution, AI process for your application. I want to also say that, a lot of the times what you're really building is you're building processes, you're building automations. Even if you have just an agent, the agent itself might not also always be doing semantic qualitative decisions. Your process could have some just very binary choices. If the product is late, then do this, right? For things that are very binary deterministic within your automation, you don't want to use AI in those steps. I think I've mentioned that already, but it's worth re-mentioning. If you're going to have decision points where your system needs to make a choice, if it's going yes or no, can this choice be done with math? Right? Is it deterministic or is it more like subjective? You're making a decision. If it's subjective, this is where you want to use AI. If it's deterministic, then you want to use just normal code, logic, right? Try to not use AI anywhere you need to just have some kind of operation being done. Now, let's move over to the right on this. So in terms of data, there are lots of different ways that you can be obtaining data, but I'm actually going to move first to the process since I said process was the underlying pillar. So looking at process, the first thing you can look at is, do you have SOPs and workflows, things that are identifying what it is you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to automate a sales process, let's say within your company, do you already have those sales processes well defined? If you do, is it some kind of a flow chart, right? If the customer is over a certain size, give them a different account manager, or if they want a certain kind of custom engineered specification developed, send them over to Chris because he handles that. Whatever your kind of process workflow is, do you already have that document? It could be a flow chart, could be just some written documents that you have. But whatever it is, take those things that you already have. If you only have visualizations, you can use AI to actually turn this into a written document that is, if there's interest, I can show that as an example of how you would do that. But if you have documents, resources, that's awesome. By the way, there's an overlap with data, which you'll see, because in the end, a process is really just a different kind of data. But I think it's important to distinguish the process from the data itself. And the distinction I'm making here is the process is determining what we need to do in order to make the goal be achieved, that process, that objective. And then the data is what information do we need in order to make good decisions along the way, right? So like if your agent needs to be speaking with a pirate accent, you're going to need to teach your agent to speak pirate. Very silly example, but what is it your agent needs to know? Maybe it needs to know the last 50 years of product designs that you've been doing so that you can come up with the right B2B product design solution for an internal use case where your sales engineer is trying to get some specifications. Okay, so the next thing to look at is, I'm going to actually link these two now that I'm looking at it, integrations and tools. So if your process is currently using back and forth some kind of external systems, maybe it's a CRM, maybe it's some kind of a database of your equipment, right? Do you have some kind of equipment database? Like any of these kinds of systems, whether they're tools or data systems, are going to be important parts of the process because within, or maybe it's like a task management system, right? Like right now, you're looking at me using ClickUp. Maybe you're using Jira or Asana or whatever it might be, or something custom. Those systems may have their own processes that are implied in that system. So you're going to want to look at what is the workflow within that tool. So, for example, maybe someone has a very loosely defined document on process, but when you look at the project management tools that you're using or your customers using, you might see that they have very distinct steps for draft, in progress, needs approval, right? So you might have implied process within your tools. CRM systems have pipeline stages, right? So all these external systems will have their own workflows. What are they? And you can learn from that. The other way that you might need to be getting your processes is through people. There might be tribal knowledge, things that are in people's heads. You're going to need to do some interviews, ask questions. How do you do XYZ? But also, what are your current pain points? There might be things in that process that are not working right now that they're having to do manually and they wish would be done better. So you don't want to just replicate what they have. You want to be understanding what it is they wish it could do. Maybe there's something right now that they can't do in that process because it's very time consuming. And so they're kind of shortcutting that process. But if you're trying to automate this with AI, you might not need to take that shortcut. So you might be able to even improve upon the process if you know what the pain points are. And similarly, it would be the I wish it kind of questions, right? So if if you can get the people you're talking to, or if you're interviewing yourself, try and document not just your pain points, but your wishes. Those are things that maybe you never even, you've always thought like, oh God, I wish I could do this thing, but I don't even know how we could do that right now. But it's important to document that because for this process, now that you're kind of rethinking the process as you're turning into an AI solution or an AI agent, you're going to need to know what that is. All right. The next thing you can do is you can just ask people to do it and you can watch them do it. That could be a screen recording, a video recording, in-person observation, take notes, whatever method you're going to be using. It's actually kind of cool to document everything, right, in this AI world. So if you're going to watch someone, I would say record them on video. You'd be surprised how much you can actually then do with that video. You could even just throw it into AI and have it analyze and ask the AI questions about process or about someone's sentiment or where they seemed frustrated or where, or you can basically collaborate now with the AI to kind of help you build the process if you're using video recordings as well. So granted, that is more time consuming, but if you're trying to do some major AI digital transformation, some major automation or replacement or augmentation of processes that people are doing, maybe your staff is just really tired of doing certain activity, but it's never really been documented before, it might be worth the time to do some actual recordings. And then, lastly, I just want to reiterate kind of this, not only the first principles of really going back to the goal, because sometimes the process that's been developed is not the optimal process for the actual problem. So it's good to ask yourself fundamentally, are there extra steps being done? Is there a more efficient way to be doing this? Are people doing it this way because they've always been doing it, right? That's important to be looking at. And then the other is that there's this thing called also process archaeology, where you're checking, there could be documentation about how people are supposed to be doing a process, but in actuality, they might be doing it very differently. And that alternative way of them doing it could actually be better. So meaning you have documented SOPs that are out of date and the way people have learned to use it is faster, more effective, less error prone. So you need to not just trust your documentations that you've been obtaining at face value. You may also, but it could also be the other way around. There could be certain processes that are defined. People are not following that in practice. And it's actually a problem, meaning that maybe there's more data errors or quality isn't being assured as well because of that. Or maybe someone in another department is never getting the information they need because they're not going through it. And then trying to understand why that's happening is important. It could be because there's so many different reasons, but maybe it's just that the current system is too cumbersome, too difficult, too problematic. Hopefully that was captured in the pain points. If it wasn't, understand from the people you're interviewing why it is that they're not doing it. If it turns out that that's a pain point they just didn't mention because they didn't even think that they've been doing it so much, they're not even realizing anymore. They're not following the exact process to the letter. Then the AI can capture, what you're doing here in this process documentation can capture it. The other thing here, I don't think I actually put it on this bullet list, is that, you can also use best practices. I didn't write best practices in here. No, I guess I didn't. All right, so there's another one, which is just best practices. So you could have, if all else fails, or as a starting point, because sometimes it's good to start with something if there's nothing, and then you can have people poke at that thing. So you can also analyze, you've done your interviews, you've understood the goal, you know what's being used there. Let's say 5 people are all doing the process in their own different way. You can come back and say, like, okay, we're going to just establish a best practice. This could be pulled from the industry, right? It doesn't have to be you inventing it. It could be either using AI or books or documentation, whatever it is, to come back with the best practices as kind of like a starting point. And then you can use that as the thing that you are getting feedback on and pushing and pulling and tweaking. So those are kind of my thoughts on process development and why it's important. Now let's go back to the data parts of it. All right, so for data, it's going to be similar, but a little bit different. So the first thing to look at is what kind of existing documents exists. So you'll notice that SOPs are in here, but there's going to be more related to the data here as well. There could be specifications. There's a lot of data also that could fit into this data mining one, or it could be an existing document. But if the AI needs to know about, what did I say earlier, like 20 years of products or 2,000 products in its knowledge base, or certain kinds of criteria of solutions that it needs to be designing, or it could be also business logic. So something that's not thought, you've got a process which says, do A, then do B. If B is something, do C. If it's something else, do D. But there's another kind of workflow, which is a logical workflow. Those are kind of decision trees. And that might be different than the actual process, or it might be within steps of your process. There might be a business logic or I guess the B here is a better example. Maybe on this B, in order to determine C or D, you want the AI to take into consideration, let's say, 3 different factors, and maybe they're qualitative in nature. And the AI needs to make an assessment on this and to make a diagnosis, and then it'll say D, right? Go down onto the bottom branch. But how is it doing this analysis? You need to think of the logic that's going into that process. Sometimes it's going to be in people's heads, it's going to be tribal, and you're going to have to interview them or talk with them or record them on a video call where you send them questions, or you set up an AI agent that they chat with that asks them the questions and they answer, and you record those answers they're giving the AI. But you need some method in order to get the knowledge from their head so that you can be building these kinds of logical decisions, these business logic points. Or you're interviewing them to get the data that you need if it's some kind of information that is in their heads that needs to be pulled out that's not been documented yet. The other thing you can do as well, if you're trying to do, for example, immortalization of your team, let's say you've got someone who's retiring, they've been with you for 20, 30 years, and they have a lot of company knowledge. It's a pretty big growing field right now of interest. And so in order to capture that information, you can also look even more broadly at capturing their communication. So you could be looking at their 20 years of emails, their last 10, 15 years of chat, and then even all of their transcripts of their voice and video calls, if you're recording those. And from this, you would basically have to run it through some kind of whiz-bang machine. It's probably going to be some kind of AI system that you're going to want to make. And you're going to take that email, if it's email, and you're going to do a whole filtration process on it first to try and categorize the kinds of emails. And when you have an email that actually has some gold information in it, you're going to want to identify that, and then you're going to want to correctly organize it in terms of where it should go and what properties it should have. This goes more into the data engineering part of it. Let me write just data engineering, and where you might be figuring out things like the meta values of your actual data that you're storing. Okay, then other places you could be getting data from are just external, right? And that could be, so here's the best practices that it was talked about in process, but it also applies to data. So there could be best practices related to this, or you could be doing research. This could be extensive. This could be also an AI process where you're doing some external general research, or you could even be pulling data from competitors, or you could be pulling it from an entire industry. But basically, you're trying to build a body of knowledge that the AI is going to need, again, in order to be making these good decisions, these criteria based decisions, because you're trying to get, you want your AI system to be, in the end, the reason we're doing all of this is you want it to be better than its baseline training, and or you want it to be making recommendations that fit your business, your way of thinking, your approach, whatever it might be. And all this data is going to help it to be more optimized for that. We'll have to do a different video on like how you actually train this AI, but that's a whole other topic. But yeah, something to put a pin in. Next thing you can do is you can also look at, again, user behavior. So the user behavior could be done in terms of an analysis. So it could be, this could be Google Analytics, or it could be an analysis of people on your work floor in your factory and how they're using certain, when they're making certain decisions, looking at the numbers, and then so maybe from those you can infer the percentage time that certain choices go in certain directions. There's some data modeling in there related to being able to quantify that. And that can help you to then analyze the final system if it's achieving a convergence on the same kind of criteria decisions. It's a totally different topic that is very interesting, but you can also be analyzing people. Could be video, could be watching them do things similar to the process, but now you're watching them do things so that you can gather information about how they're making decisions, what data, what insights are they bringing to the table, and then capturing that. And then, integrations and synthesis. So we've already talked about that in terms of the process. Synthesis, this would be very similar. It would be, we're going to just synthesize information, and then you're going to have to get input or feedback on of that. So what I will say with both of these systems is that, you're going to have a process, you're going to have data, and then you're going to be using your, automation, which is going to have some AI in it, right? Because we're talking about AIs. There's probably going to be AI in your automation, and then you're going to want to be testing the system at first, right? So you're going to be testing it, and then if you're getting enough good results, you're going to be releasing it. But then what you also want to be doing, even while you're testing it and also after, is you want to be having your feedback loop. So when you have your process defined, you're going to want people to review the process, tell you that it's good. And then when you have a failure in your result, you're going to want to understand where that failure happened. And you have the same thing going on here in the data, and you have the same thing going on here in the automation. So if you have a failure, was it a problem with the process? Was it a problem with the data? Was it a problem with the automation? Maybe your automation needs to account for there being no data, right? Or that the AI has no recommendation. There can be all these edge cases that you want to think about them all as much as you can up front, but there's going to be things that fall between the cracks. And so then is, how do you deal with those error handlings, and what process do you have in place? And then how do you capture insights from that? And then ultimately, how do you take those insights and feed it back in order to improve the system? And that same kind of feedback loop is going to apply across the board. So if you have data that you've synthesized, for example, and people, you might want still have someone to look at it, but maybe it's way too much data that you can even do that. So maybe then you generate something like 2,000 tests to run through the system to try and check your data and to try and check the results. And if you're seeing the results as pass fail, you can check the fails, and then you can have a person look at maybe just the 20 items that failed, have them tell you how the data should be improved, right? And then you rerun and you pass it all. Of course, there can be, I don't want to go too deep into this, but you can also have, because this video will get too long, but you could have a false positive, and you could also have a false negative, where the real result is pass and the real result is fail. And so you also need to account for that in the sense that, if your system thinks that it was a pass, and this is where that human in the loop versus on the loop is important, or having some kind of way to judge this final output in your AI system. But you need to be thinking about that as well. I'll just leave it there, because if you don't account for that, you could also be generating, your system might think it's doing a great job, but actually it's giving the wrong answers, right? Wrong data. And similarly, the system could also think it's wrong, but someone looks at it and says, no, 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 that's actually correct. And it could be because maybe some of your data was incorrect, or when you synthesized, you put the wrong data in and it doesn't match, and now you're getting the wrong expected result. Okay, I'm going to leave that there. Try to make these videos a little shorter. I know this video is probably still long, but thank you so much, Lemming, for watching my video. I really appreciate it. And it's a pretty new channel, so if you have any feedback, comments, questions, things you want me to talk about more, I'm trying to do an alternation right now between philosophical, theoretical topics and more practical. Although my practical topics, I consider this practical, it's still pretty high level. I could go much deeper and just show like actual code or actual workflows or actual documents or things like that. But I'm trying to keep it more theoretical, even if it's applied. So it's applied theory versus philosophical theory. Those are my two main areas I'm touching on right now, and we'll see based on your feedback and where things evolve if we go into the weeds more. So again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.